Okie dokie. All right, we are recording.
Okay.
So, because of the time of day, there aren't going to be any students with us. So, we're going to
Okay.
do this like a podcast if that works for you.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So, welcome to Judaism, Jewish Community, and Race, a course from Pluralistic Rabbinical Seminary. This masterclass is made possible by our friends at Tribe Herald Media, and we certainly are grateful for that. Our guest is Professor Cristina Ramirez. Cristina is a library manager one of the new Henrico County Public Library, the Varina Area Library. Haven't been to Varina in a little bit. Should go check it out. She is a published academic author, writer, national speaker, and presenter, as well as a doctoral student in educational leadership from UNE. She is currently an adjunct professor of library and information studies at ODU and previously at CUA. She's been teaching, presenting, speaking on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which we're going to get into, in libraries and government services for over a decade. She also sits on the board of directors for a lot of really interesting organizations here in RVA. That's Richmond, Virginia, for those of you who don't know. So, Cristina, welcome to PRS.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, I'd like to begin by reading something fun about you that is actually in your bio. So here's the line. She is multilingual and spends as much time as she can in her other house in Spain every year with her family. So, I don't have a house in Spain. So tell us about that. Tell us about your personal background.
So my mother is from Spain and my father is Mexican American, born in South Texas, family from northern Mexico, South Texas. Borders there changed, not the people. So some of them were considered Mexican, some Texan. My dad had gone to Spain to teach. My mother was his student. That's how they met. Fell in love, got married. And we've always spent the summers going back to Spain to when my grandparents were alive to stay with them during the summer and to see my other relatives and just to get that kind of immersive experience with my mom's family and that culture. And then we'd spend the rest of the year here in the States and go visit my family in Texas. But really, Spain has always kind of been home base. My mom's house in Segovia, because we moved around a lot in the United States. We moved from California to New York, Louisiana. I've lived in Texas, DC, Maryland, Virginia. But the house in Spain has never moved. So that's always been kind of like home base. And my mother is at the point where she is going to transfer it to myself and my sister.
Wow.
So we're going to have to maintain it the way she has over the years, remotely, and then over there part of the year and pay property taxes and all that good stuff.
So, gotcha. Sounds like Spain is your center of gravity and becoming.
It is, and it has been as the more I've kind of dove into my Jewish ancestry and the more I've reconnected with that and the more I've kind of really also thought about what I want to do after I work for the government in the US, it really has become kind of a big part of my life in terms of me wanting to start a business over there when I retire from government here.
Okay, wow, fantastic. So, let's dive right into that then. So, when we think of Jews of color, we should, of course, be thinking about Latinx folks. And I'm wondering, do you feel like we do?
It's probably such a foreign concept. I mean, in the United States, Ashkenazi is the normative. It's the default. It's kind of like how the whole issue that we're living right now about Black Lives Matter and the protests is saying white should not be the default or the normative or the canvas that we judge every other community with. And I would say that in American Judaism, Ashkenazi culture, Yiddish, being from having Eastern European roots is kind of seen as the default. So when someone presents themselves in a Jewish space, in a community, and they're a person of color, the first question a lot of people get is, oh, did you convert? Oh, how did you come out? Are you lost? Are you the help? I've heard friends that have said they've been confused for the catering group, it's a hard space to navigate because I think it's just a foreign concept for a lot of folks that maybe have their roots from Eastern Europe and that's what they grew up with. And so to meet someone who's Black, who's Latino, who's Asian, and also a Jew is like, whoa, how did that happen?
Have you had any Jewish experiences when you're at home in Spain?
The only experiences I've had there, where my mom is from, they really haven't had an active Jewish community since they were kicked out by the King and Queen of Spain in 1492. But there is a museum there where they do try to capture the history and the culture, and they are starting a lot more relationships with this thing called Red de Juderías, which is like a network of Jewish neighborhoods or Jewish areas. And is they're connecting with major cities in Spain like Barcelona. Where else do they have it? I think Leon. They have a number of cities that have like a rich, deep Jewish history that's mostly pre-medieval ages. And they are reconnecting with that history. They're also working actively to reconnect with Israel. And they have found that there's really so much interest from a lot of Israelis coming to Spain to learn about that Jewish history. And the piece I want to bring to the conversation is how do you reconnect Latinos to that Jewish history, especially Jews of the Latinos of the Southwest, where my family's from, because a lot of Latinos in the Southwest are discovering Jewish ancestry and they don't know how to reconnect to that.
Wow.
Some studies show that maybe 25% of Latinos in the Southwest and in Latin America might have Jewish ancestry.
You know, it's interesting what you say about this idea of like these, medieval communities, right? These old communities, because you can trace, from the Babylonian expulsion, right? Some of these communities, these really predate, the year 70.
Mm-hmm.
There's these waves of immigration, and then looking at, after 1492 and the changes that happened there, it's really fascinating. It seems like this isn't something we, teach in Hebrew schools.
No, and it's also, I think a lot of, there's some Israeli organizations that are realizing the value and the importance of this moment in history. And they have realized, you know what, we have a large population of Latinos that are interested in learning about their Jewish ancestry. They may not want to come back all the way, but they want to enrich where they are, their knowledge of who they are. And we have an opportunity to connect with them. And I've been listening to some webinars from the Israeli, it might be the consulate in Miami, and they're doing a lot of work right now around kind of doing that connection between Israel, Judaism, and Latinos. And so there is a kind of a growing awareness.
Okay, very interesting. So for you, tell us about what they call your Jewish journey. Tell us about your story.
So I was raised, like a lot of Latinas, in a Catholic home. My parents, my father had probably got maybe a little bit more traditional Catholic upbringing in South Texas. He still went to the Latin Mass. My mother, even though she was educated by Jesuits in Spain, I don't think she was really that gung-ho. And she kind of, she's like, some of this stuff doesn't make sense, but it's what you do. It was kind of like Spain was, especially under Franco, it was a Catholic kind of theocratic state. And but I never felt like it made sense to me. And I did have my first communion. But then when it came to having my confirmation around 12, 13, I said, I can't do this. I don't want to do this anymore. And they were like, can you say why? Do you understand why? And I said, I can't. It just isn't for me. And I dropped out of my confirmation class and I stopped going to church at age 13. I didn't know why, but it just didn't make sense to me. And I started kind of reading about different world religions and studying just on my own. I grew up with, a daughter of two professors, so there were always lots of books at home and we'd always go to the library. And I just started reading a lot about Judaism, and I started studying it and studying a little bit of Hebrew. And then it was in my early 20s that I formally converted through the conservative movement when I was living in Texas. And around that same time, my father had also been doing a lot of genealogical work and learning about his ancestry from northern Mexico. And he discovered that we were descended from the crypto Jews that left from Spain to come to the New World, escaping the Inquisition. They settled in northern Mexico, and they tried to maintain their Judaism for a period of time, but eventually they all had to become Catholic over time. That's what happened, and there was a lot of intermarriage and with the locals. But so he's been able to kind of show that lineage to some of the explorers that came on boats to that area, to the New World, and that he's descended from that group of crypto-Jewish explorers.
Wow, that's incredible. Just out of curiosity, it sounds like you converted and either around the same time or afterwards. That's when your father was doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
And
did that do anything for you?
Mm-hmm.
Did that change anything about your conversion for you at all?
I think it just kind of confirmed why I was drawn to it and why I was so interested in it. And it also has been this kind of wild journey that I've kind of dragged my parents along to Judaism too, because even though they still go to church on Sundays, they live stream it like most people live stream services now. They have gone to a number of Jewish services with me, to Shabbat services, Passover. They are so much more interested in learning about their Jewish roots too. I buy them books. We went to Israel last summer together, the three of us. That was a pretty amazing experience. So they, in many ways, they've embraced a lot of learning about this too, and wanting to know more.
That's absolutely incredible, and it's an interesting study in the sort of tendency in certain parts of the Jewish world to have these like ethnic purity tests, and that the ethnic continuity is what matters. And, in some ways, someone like yourself who would be mistaken as someone without Jewish physical, ancestry, is someone who is actually, in some ways, bringing people more into an understanding of here's where we come from and our background, and, pick what of that you may be interested in.
Yeah, I mean, I just think, I feel like for me, learning about our family history just kind of confirmed why I was so interested in learning about this, and why I really feel like it's an important part of my life, and almost like something I need to do to educate other Latinos that, you may have some of these roots as well. And if you do you want to learn more about them? Because they're really rich, they're deep. There's a lot to learn, and then it just kind of full circle back to my mom's hometown. That's during the Middle Ages, it's a tiny little town in the mountains. The only thing it survives on is tourism, which is why it's not doing so well right now with COVID. And there were 5 synagogues during the Middle Ages at that time, but it's also, interestingly and ironically, the place where the king and queen, Ferdinand and Isabella, issued their decree to expel the Moors and the Jews. All happened in that tiny little town in the mountains.
Wow, that's incredible. It's interesting because this reminds me of one of our educators, Rabbi Barbara Ayello, who is an Italian American and is one of very few rabbis in Italy, and particularly in southern Italy, and was until recently the only female rabbi that had been in the entire country, working actively in the country, and sort of helping people with tracing their family stories, right? How many people were expelled from the Levant and found their way into Italy? And it sounds like, you're someone who may find themselves in that position with this sort of change of Spain becoming more and more where you want to be.
Yeah, and I mean, Spain, a lot of people will fault the law, and I fault it for it being just so cumbersome. And then Spanish bureaucracy is like no joke. If we criticize the slowness of our government here, but a number of countries like Spain, Portugal, Germany with the Holocaust, but Spain and Portugal were giving citizenship back to people who could prove they were descended from Jews that had been expelled. The law, you could say, was sort of successful, sort of not. I mean, all said and told, it might only be less than 100,000 that applied, and we're still all caught up in the bureaucracy waiting for the final approvals. So there is interest. There are people that have maintained these stories, these lineages, whether they ended up living in Turkey, Israel, some of them in Holland. In Latin America, there's a large community in Mexico, in I think I want to say Colombia. So there's communities that definitely have kind of maintained some traditions and some historical references. And this many generations ago, I heard that this person they were Jewish. So there's a lot more interest in learning about that now. independent of these laws, which some of them are time sensitive. So if folks didn't get their documents in a row by a certain time, they're kind of out of luck. But it doesn't mean that the Spanish government or the Portuguese government is not interested in exploring this further, because I think they see a lot of potential in reconnecting with their former colonies, the members of the former colonies, and again, tourism. That's kind of what drives a lot of these countries.
Do you have a sense from different places that you lived in the United States and then your time abroad that there is a better place to be a Jew of color? Has there been experiences regionally or anything like that that have worked better, or is it kind of all?
I would say for me, it's just growing into myself and becoming older and wiser. And I think the older I get, the less I care what people think. And so it's come to no, it's true. I mean, when I was in my 20s, I always felt like I had to justify to, if I belonged to a synagogue or if I was hanging out in a Jewish setting and people having a billion questions and, oh my God, where did this come from? Why are you doing this? Why are you here? And now it's like, hey, I don't really know you. This is who I am. If I get to know you, I can share. But right now I'm here just like you are. And I guess just kind of coming into who you are and kind of setting boundaries. And yes, there is an education piece, but not feeling like I have to change who I am to fit in, because I can't, I didn't grow up with a certain background, so I can't change who I am, but that doesn't mean that I can't enrich other people's backgrounds. And I have found that enrichment, because of the diversity in the Jewish community here, and because people do come from so many places, I have found Richmond to be probably the most welcoming and open, just because we have so many folks from different backgrounds here.
It's very interesting what you just said about this idea of Richmond being, a place that's better, and this idea that it seems to me of we can, as Jews by choice or converts or whatever word you want to use, we can in some sense enrich and make more flavorful the Jewish community. To how do we find a way into an ancestry? I mean, in your case, it's different, but an ancestry that we don't have. I suppose with sort of the Ashkenazi part of it, that's true in your case. But it's a fascinating thing. So I'm curious, when you were talking about the education component, because you are in diversity education. I think a lot of people that we might talk to, if we even used the phrase diversity education, it's like triggering, for lack of a better word, right? And so I started thinking about what might that be. So, this image of like someone's going to scold me or someone's going to guilt me and point me out and say, here's, on the scorecard of privilege, here's how high you rank and you need to feel bad about yourself. And it's interesting because there's a little of that stereotype. Then there's also the stereotype of everyone has to change. I don't have to do anything. And then there's this other piece of you saying I needed to grow kind of into myself and be comfortable with who I am. Can you kind of guide us through all of that? Because that just seems like a big mess, to be honest.
Well, the diversity consulting and work that I do in libraries is around more the issue of access to resources and outreach and issues like collection development, programming, activities. Are we having the programs and activities that really reach out and reflect the communities we serve? If we're serving a majority, say in a particular area, African American community, do we have enough books and magazines and movies that reflect those lived experiences? The same thing with outreach experiences. Are we going to where the communities are to really engage with them and share the resources we have? I would say it's kind of similar with this piece on educating people about diversity within the Jewish community. Is, do we have resources that the community can read up on or access, or films they can see just to spark dialogue? Are we creating the spaces? Now I know with the pandemic, we have a lot of limited venues to do this, and it has to be mostly online. But if we do come back to normal, are we showcasing films at, say, the JCC, where we can spark a dialogue, bring in a speaker who can say, all right, this was a great movie on Latino Jews or Black Jews. Let's talk about it. Let's engage. I think we need to create those spaces, and you can do it in a non-threatening way, not where you're, like you said, lecturing or making someone feel bad about their privilege, but just saying there's so much more that you may not be aware of, but this is an opportunity to learn.
Very interesting. Yeah, this idea of creating the space for learning versus a your sort of top-down kind of thing. I'm wondering, I think any of us who's online right now, who follows any kind of sort of newer Jewish media, suddenly it just seemed like out of the woodwork, everything was LGBT, Jews of color, a lot more women-oriented and trans-oriented. I suppose I mentioned LGBT earlier, but I'm wondering from your perspective, seeing a lot of companies and these media outlets, news outlets, are all sort of promoting diversity all of a sudden, right? We're all home and, the commercials look wildly different, it seems, than they were in the past. Where do we draw the line between sort of tokenism or wokeness as a marketing tactic versus sort of actual substantial education? And part of why I asked that question is that it seems to me like if you had a different sort of career, if you weren't working in the library world, but you were asking yourself these same questions, you would be in the marketing department, because you would be a question of like, well, who's our audience and how do we? So what do you?
I think that the avalanche right now that we're seeing of whether it's really wokeness or it's just people kind of jumping on maybe a cultural phenomenon, I think that's obviously a function of everything we've been living. I think the pandemic kept people at home. It kept people really much more kind of captive to what's happening in a local and national level. And then you had a number of high-profile deaths in the Black community that sparked the latest round of kind of the stronger and the national level Black Lives Matter movement. That really we're living right now, I think, through kind of almost a second civil rights movement in the U.S., and it is in many ways bigger than the one we experienced before because it is digital, it is local, it's national, it's international. We have other countries supporting us and saying, I want to support African Americans, and all over the world, Berlin, in Paris, in London. So I think, yes, you have that piece where everybody's jumping on that. Some people for political gain, some people for financial gain. When some companies say that, you have to take it with a grain of salt and say, is that really something that you believe in? Because if you believe in that, then I want to see some policy changes in how you hire people, how you train people, how you promote people. There's that whole HR component that needs to be incorporated if you're really going to say, I believe in Black Lives Matter. Are you really hiring and training future Black leaders in your organization? And I would say the same thing for libraries and even in what you do is if we want to kind of create that pipeline of more diverse leaders in the Jewish community and the library community, are we creating the avenues? Are we recruiting them to library school, rabbinic school? Are we then offering opportunities for them to get ahead, to get that network that they need to get the jobs they need? So I think that applies to any industry, but we're living with the big piece that we're seeing, statues coming down, a lot of people making these very dramatic statements. I think the real change is going to take a lot longer, and it's more behind the scenes, and it's going to be politically based, and it's really going to come down to policies and almost HR policies, organization to organization, to put your money where your mouth is in their budgets.
Yeah, it is tough, this sort of shock and awe of change that, like you described it as the avalanche, that all of that comes down. And then at a certain point you wake up and, okay, maybe the needle has moved, 1 degree in a different direction, but not as much.
Yeah, because the real change is going to take people sitting down and pulling apart. How do we hire people, say, in police departments? How do we train them? How do we recruit new firefighters that are diverse? How do we encourage teachers or hire teachers that are going to teach African American history? So there's so many pieces to look at, and that's what's going to make the lasting change.
Do you think that this is sort of now taking what we're talking about, which is, beyond the Jewish community, but zeroing in a little bit, do you think that this is a moment for Jews of color that will have lasting change? And if so, what are some of those hopes?
I do think so. I mean, I've been playing around online. I've been reading more interviews in a lot of Jewish news sources where they interview a Jew of color who's also a rapper, and how he combines Nissim Black, how he combines his love of the Hasidic world with lyrics, and how he raps about it. And I kind of went down a rabbit hole seeing, oh, this is a whole subgenre I didn't even know about. But I think, if anything, I think what the time in this country that we're living in will help highlight these little pockets of folks that maybe don't fit into any of the larger categories, but that bridge communities, and to highlight them and give them a wider audience so that people can connect with them.
It's interesting, and I should give a little bit of a shout out, since you mentioned hip hop. The founder of Tribe Herald Media, Yitz Jordan, aka Y Love, sort of the first Hasidic person of color rapper that I had ever encountered. So it's fun now, over a decade later, to see like Nissim Black and other people who are doing Jewishly influenced hip hop and things like that.
But I do think it's a moment, not just in that's one pocket there. It's perhaps the crossover and the mixing of African American and Jewish, and in that case Hasidic communities. I also have seen, just working with the Jewish Federation of New Mexico, when they kind of helped me learn about the process of applying for citizenship with Spain and learning about my roots. They are helping a lot of Latinos learn about their Jewish ancestry and reconnect. So there are organizations and groups that because of different things happening right now at this time and place, are working with different communities to help them make those connections in a way that I had never seen before.
So I'll play a bit of the devil's advocate. So there's a lot of these, opportunities now to connect. Do you think that there's anything, not specific to any of the organizations you've mentioned, anything like that, but do you think that there's any kind of ulterior motive, or there's an extra motive for this, or do you think really this is a great benevolent moment that we're in?
I mean, individuals may have an ulterior motive in that it may help sell an edition or an issue of a newspaper or magazine, or maybe a hot topic. But I think overall, a lot of people participated. What was it? Like 7,000 people participated in the live stream of the Juneteenth Shabbat service, where it was two African-American lesbian rabbis who led the services. I don't know if that would have happened 2 years ago, 3 years ago. Yeah. And so I think just maybe there's an interest and there's a desire to learn about things that are a little bit different than yourself, and to see how other people experience Judaism, how other people have come to it. And I can't imagine that many people, there's an ulterior motive. I do think that there's an interest.
I wonder if on some level this can be inspirational for Ashkenazi Jews. And, I say that because, here we are talking about Jews of color and having these interviews. And one of the things that we've talked about is the Ashken normativity, right?
Yes.
This is the word that's being used now. And I could imagine if you were, some like 22-year-old going to Hillel, and you're, like 75% of American Jews, where you're Eastern European or German background, you could feel on one hand like, I'm just not flavorful enough or interesting enough. I'm just another white Jew. But I also wonder if there are people who are Jewish but not really interested, engaged, or affiliated, and if suddenly they see, for example, Sandra Lawson, right, a Black lesbian rabbi who I've had the pleasure of knowing for a few years, or someone like yourself working in the Latino community and, all of that, if maybe it can be a little bit inspirational and actually make Judaism more interesting on some.
I think so. I absolutely think so. I mean, in my early 20s, when I was going to Hillel at UT Austin and spending a lot of time with the community there, yes, it was very Ashkeno normative. And I had to learn some, I had to pick up some Yiddish phrases, and I had to eat food that I was like, man, this is just, there's no flavor. What is going on here? Like, this is not real food, people, come on. And I think that we can enrich the community because we can bring, to use kind of a very Hasidic idea, these sparks, and bring a kind of a diverse spark to the community that can engage people that are Jews by birth and unaffiliated, or have found services or communities not too inspiring or interesting, and say, wow, this person's really into social justice, or this person's really into this aspect of Judaism that I hadn't considered. And we can add that element to it that can make other people feel connected in different ways, and if they don't feel connected to the way they were brought up.
I recall going to a Shabbat service maybe 15 years ago where the cantor tried to introduce a Ladino melody or something to a Shabbat song, and it just landed flat. And because people were not familiar with it, and there's a certain joy for people in sacred spaces of, we're going to do Shalom Aleichem the way I know it. We're going to say Kaddish the way I know it. Even the sort of disruptive moment of, when we say Kaddish, we tend to say it now in the Israeli, the non-Ashkenazi inflection. So Yit Gadal v'Yit as opposed to Yiz Gadal v'Yizgadash, maybe more of an earlier in American Jewish history normative thing. I remember one rabbi of a Reform synagogue, he did it that way, even though then the younger people were all saying Yit Gadal because that's what they knew. And I wonder, how do we balance that between this need for people to have the comfort of ritual versus, hey, let's throw in a Ladino melody. Let's learn about the Persian Jewish community and maybe some rituals, customs, things like that.
I think you can do it in a way in which maybe like an 80-20 rule. You can 80% of the time, you can maintain what's comfortable and what people have feel connected to and bring some comfort. But you can also create educational Shabbats or teaching experiences through your synagogue or community in which you say, you know what, this month, it's also Hispanic Heritage Month. I'm just making something up off the top of my head. And why don't we learn a Ladino melody, and I can give you guys some background on this. And so you make it like a community learning experience. I think there's plenty of ways to do it in a fun way that you're not maybe springing it on people, and so they feel unprepared. And if they were going that night and they were expecting something, kind of feel, oh, that wasn't really quite what I was hoping for.
Interesting. So sort of going with that train of thought a little bit, this is a rabbinical seminary. Unfortunately, because of the time of day, our students are off doing other things, such as you and I. But I'm wondering, do you have any ideas like this, like 80-20 and others that you feel people in their rabbinic roles can be mindful of or introducing? Granted, at PRS, our role as, helping create Jewish leaders for the future of Judaism isn't necessarily about, more
Right.
synagogues and more traditional institutions, though it certainly could be. Do you have any sort of tips, wisdom, anything you feel they need to know about specifically?
I guess it's such a broad question, and I really think it depends on where people live. But I think, if you happen to live in the West Coast, if you happen to live in a community, I guess what I also tell people in the library world, you have to know who your community is. You have to know who you're serving. And it may take some research using very basic resources like census data, and learning who is living in your community. What have been some of the trends over the last two censuses to see changes in percent change in, Latino, Asian, African American growth or decrease. Also, it's really kind of getting out there, driving around, seeing who's out there. And I think people every community has luminary and kind of what I call people that that kind of control the doors to the gates to that particular community. You have to get to know those folks, establish that relationship. So you start building your network and you find someone who's a very trusted, say, Latino community leader. That person can open a lot of doors and then help you start making the bridging that Latino community, the Jewish community, or whatever it is. And I think it's really putting in that boots on the ground effort and getting to know who are leaders in your community. And then also, if there are people that stand out that you've heard about, really making an effort to bring them into and then, like you said, a lot of the folks that are going to be your students are going to not necessarily be pulpit rabbis. They may just be working in other community organizations, but we're not islands, so I really think you have to know who you're serving, who's around you.
Beautiful. That's wonderful. Anything else that you think we should be talking about?
I really do think that we're in a time that's just there's so much promise. I do get bogged down and distressed over politics at the national level, and I do get distressed over how things are going with the virus. But I also think that there's a lot of possibility for us to make some major changes and inroads in how we see each other, especially the younger generations, how we relate to each other. And I think there has probably never been a better opportunity right now for young, modern Jews in America to really connect with more people than ever before and to form more alliances and relationships with other communities. Now's the time. Both, just what's happening politically, what's happening with how people are having these conversations around diversity and equity and inclusion. And also because of demographic changes, you have a lot more intermarriage. You have people that are Jews that are of mixed ancestry, people that come to it with so many different backgrounds. And we might be at a tipping point in American Jewish history where this is the moment for students to really kind of take the reins on that and make some meaningful changes in their communities.
That's wonderful. Well, Professor Cristina Ramirez, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And you and I actually, I'll break the fourth wall here. You and I are about to have a conversation offline here that hopefully will go in the favor of PRS. So we'll see how that goes. But again, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Yeah, it was great.